Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Conquered, Why the Army of Tennessee Failed, by Larry J. Daniel, narrated by Paul Heitsch. Preface. In 1941, Stanley F. Horn wrote his book, The Army of Tennessee. It proved to be an excellent introduction, and when I encountered the book as a teen, its subject captivated me. Since Horn used no manuscript material, however, the scope proved limited. In 1967 and 1971, Thomas L. Connolly completed his epic two-volume history of the Army of Tennessee, Army of the Heartland and Autumn of Glory. Connolly became the father of what, for Civil War historians, is known as Western revisionism, elevating the role of the theater in the history of the conflict. So monumental were his works that, even to this day, they represent the starting point for any serious student of the Western Confederacy. Why, then, another book on the Army of Tennessee? Connolly's purpose was to do for the Western Army what Douglas Southall Freeman had done for Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia a generation earlier: provide a command-level study. The Army is thus viewed from the perspective of a top-down military approach. 50 years have come and gone since Connolly's two volumes appeared. It was thus time for a re-examination. Needless to say, many new sources and interpretations have come to light in the ensuing decades. I did not intend this volume to be an extension of Connolly's work. It is designed to view the Army as an institution. To further distinguish my work from Connolly's, I avoided a straight narrative approach. I instead partially adapted the topical and narrative approach of Joseph Gladhar's General Lee's Army, which I used as a model. Listeners will find that I did not spend an inordinate amount of time rehashing standard battlefield narratives. Since 1971, a half-dozen books have been published on the Battle of Shiloh alone, and David Powell recently completed his iconic three-volume study of the Battle of Chickamauga. I thus attempted to insert the latest scholarship and interpretations that have emerged. While I deal with grand strategy and operational movements, my intent was to go beyond the battlefield to examine the Army's social history in a war and society approach. In order to explore new dimensions and balance the argument, and to keep this book to a single volume, I had to make choices. The title of the book, Conquered, reflects the end of the story. The book itself addresses two questions. First, why did the Army come to defeat? Since the Army of Northern Virginia won most of its battles, and the Army of Tennessee lost most of its battles, the causes of Western Confederate defeat must be distinctive. Connolly's answer was inept leadership and the constant infighting among the generals. He thus saw defeat in terms of personalities rather than competing influences. While personalities unquestionably played a role, many underappreciated factors also affected the Army of Tennessee's ultimate fate. Sectionalism retarded the Army's unity. Geographic challenges posed by the region's rivers defied both tactical and political solutions. The Army faced diminishing manpower, a declining cavalry corps, and an ill-trained officer corps, especially at the field level. There were also logistical handicaps and a lack of mobility, the destructive political policies of President Jefferson Davis, the intrinsic strategic connection between Mississippi and Tennessee, and Kentucky's feeble response to the cause. I do agree with established theory that, for the Confederates, the war was lost on the battlefield. Yet many cumulative effects of the above handicaps unquestionably weakened and demoralized the Army. Defeat in the West cannot thus be seen entirely through the prism of inept generals. If Lee's Army came to symbolize what Gladhar termed the vitality of the Confederate States, then the Army of Tennessee came to represent the frailty of the Confederacy. Gladhar concluded that the defeat of the Army of Northern Virginia was not caused by industry, culture, the manpower shortage, or slavery, but rather by intense and sustained Union pressure that caused serious fissures in all these areas. The demise of the Army of Tennessee likewise did not come exclusively from internal Army factors. Outside influences, Northern policy and leadership, and the breakdown of the Southern home front also played a role. In light of so many shortcomings, why then did it take the better-equipped, supposedly better-led and larger Union Army of the Cumberland so long to neutralize its opponent? The answer to that question, beyond inept leadership, which was not confined to the Confederates, is also multi-dimensional. It revolves around a web of interconnected factors, such as the brotherhood of the Confederate soldiery, religious revivals which not only shielded the men from the stresses of war, but also emphasized God's providential blessing over the army, and, in the fog of war, a zealous belief that even as late as 1864 the war was still quite winnable. If Thomas Connolly was the father of Western revisionism, Richard McMurray, more than any historian, developed a succinct Western theater thesis that the war stalemated in the East and was decided in the West. The Confederates lost the military phase of the war, McMurray concluded, and those battles took place in the West. To be sure, there were counterattacks from Eastern historians who insisted that the Virginia front was paramount, but the Virginia dominance of Civil War historiography has been seriously challenged. No manuscript can be completed without the encouragement, advice, and corrections of other scholars. My deep appreciation goes to Stephen Woodworth and Timothy Smith for plowing through some of the early chapters of the manuscript, and to Richard McMurray for reading a large number of the chapters. They are all veteran authors and friends. Earl Hess graciously sent me the advance galley of his now published book, The Battle of Peachtree Creek, to aid me in my research. Anyone doing research at the Stones River and Chickamauga National Battlefield Parks will encounter Jim Lewis and Jim Ogden, both of whom know their subject better than anyone and are always willing to cooperate. As a member of the Historians of the Civil War Western Theater, I also bounced ideas off several of my colleagues, including Wiley Sword, Dave Powell, and Sam Elliott. My deep appreciation also goes to Bob Jenkins for clarifying some of the North Georgia mysteries. 1. Flawed Foundations. The Provisional Army of Tennessee. The beginning of the Army of Tennessee was the Tennessee State Army, the so-called Provisional Army of Tennessee, under the titular leadership of Governor Isham G. Harris. It was the State Army that became the genesis of the Confederate Army. From its inception, there were cracks in the foundation. Political clout, slave power, and personal friendship to the governor became the typical gateways to military commission. Desiring to reach beyond his Democratic base and cultivate the pro-slavery Whigs, Harris gave the 2 major general appointments to Democrats, but 4 of the 5 brigadier commissions went to Whigs. The appointments of the major generals, Gideon Pillow of Memphis and Samuel R. Anderson of Nashville, did not come as a surprise. Pillow, a 2-time vice presidential aspirant, Mexican War veteran, large slaveholder, and ardent secessionist, had an 8-year association with Harris. He unquestionably had a dark side, being jealous, egotistical, and vengeful. Anderson was the 57-year-old president of the Bank of Tennessee. He had combat experience, having served as lieutenant colonel of the 1st Tennessee during the Mexican War. The 5 brigadiers included Benjamin F. Cheatham, the foul-mouthed, hard-drinking proprietor of the Nashville racetrack, 65-year-old Robert C. Foster, a Franklin attorney, longtime member of the Tennessee General Assembly, and veteran of the Mexican War, 41-year-old State Attorney General John L. Sneed, an old friend of Pillow's, William R. Caswell of East Tennessee, who, like Sneed, was a captain in the 1st Tennessee Cavalry during the Mexican War, and Felix Zollicoffer, a former U.S. Senator and Nashville newspaper editor. The Confederate government subsequently granted brigadier commissions to Pillow and Anderson, but only reluctantly granted commissions to Cheatham and Zollicoffer. In his efforts at political inclusiveness, Harris had snubbed West Pointers, granting them only support positions. Daniel Donaldson became adjutant general, Bushrod Johnson chief engineer, John P. McCown, A.P. Stewart, and Melton A. Hayes headed the fledgling artillery corps, and Richard G. Fain, who had quit the Army upon graduation to become a Nashville merchant, became commissary general. 25-year-old Captain Moses H. Wright, who had previously served at the Watervliet and St. Louis arsenals, would lead the Ordnance Bureau. Only McCown and Johnson had any combat experience. McCown had no connection to Harris, he would grow to detest him, and had gone through an embarrassing court-martial incident. Marshal Polk, another West Pointer, commanded a Memphis battery. 5 other Tennessee West Pointers, John Adams, Henry Davidson, William H. Jackson, James A. Smith, and Lawrence Peck, had not resigned their U.S. commissions at the time of the State Army formation. Andrew Jackson III, grandson of Andrew Jackson, joined the Confederate Army before the firing on Fort Sumter. Donelson, the most senior of the West Pointers, had served in the regular army only 6 months before resigning his commission. Several of Harris's appointments went to civilians with little or no military background. 49-year-old Vernon K. Stevenson, founder of the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad, became quartermaster general. The job dealt with contracts and finances, so the appointment seemed reasonable. There may have been another reason. Stevenson was widely rumored to be a possible Democratic candidate for governor in the fall, and Harris may have wished to clear the field for his second run. Also in the quartermaster department was George W. Cunningham, a 40-year-old Warren County merchant. Dr. Benjamin W. Avent, a highly respected 48-year-old Murfreesboro physician, was tapped as the Army's medical director. William H. Carroll, the Nashville Postmaster General and son of a former governor, became Inspector General. Those who knew him dismissed him as a stupid drunkard who could be easily controlled. Politics and position influenced the top appointments, but Tennessee simply lacked the military tradition of Virginia. Of the West Pointers in the state army, only 2 would distinguish themselves in the Army of Tennessee, Johnson and Stewart. Perhaps even more serious was the fact that there was an even greater dearth of professionally trained officers at the level of colonel. Of the 135 men who would rise to the rank of colonel in Tennessee, excluding Andrew Jackson III, none had attended West Point, and only 4 had graduated from private military academies. In comparison, 16 West Pointers served as Virginia colonels, 57 from the Virginia Military Institute, 2 from the U.S. Naval Academy, and 7 from private military academies. Even the Virginia Military Institute graduates living in Tennessee proved to be a remarkably undistinguished lot. 8 of the Tennessee colonels had backgrounds in the militia, which were worth little, and 19 had combat experience in the Mexican or Seminole War. Wealth and prominence served as the basis for the appointments of most of the Tennessee colonels. There were 9 physicians and 40 lawyers. The Provisional Army was also logistically handicapped. Initially, the state arsenal housed only 8,761 arms, almost all old flintlocks. Practically speaking, the entire lot proved worthless, at least until the arms could be altered to percussion. In late April 1861, Louisiana Governor Thomas O. Moore shipped to Memphis 3,000 arms and 300,000 rounds of ammunition, all from the captured U.S. arsenal at Baton Rouge. The governors of Mississippi and Arkansas also offered 16 old field guns. Additional boxes of ammunition arrived from Baton Rouge, followed by 2 carloads of small arms from Richmond, Virginia. In May, the Confederate Secretary of War, Leroy Walker, released 4,000 muskets to Tennessee, but there were strings attached. They could only be issued to regiments joining the Confederate service. Already, 3 such regiments had been transferred to Virginia. Harris pleaded with Walker to relax the policy, but to no avail. Pillow subsequently stopped 3,000 flintlock muskets passing through Memphis on the way to Mobile, Alabama. The general's alarmist language convinced Walker to issue 1,200 of the lot to Tennessee troops. By state count, there were 5,000 percussion muskets in Memphis and 3,000 in Nashville by May 12. Authorities encouraged volunteers to show up with hunting rifles and shotguns. Although the press boasted that 75,000 such firearms existed, officials estimated that only 4,000 could be gathered. Pillow claimed that he could put 25,000 men in the field if he could only arm them. The men were trained in camps of instruction, such as Camp Brown at Union City and Camp Truesdale in Middle Tennessee, 4 miles from the Kentucky border. Small until drills occurred, but camp social life seemed to be the order of the day. James Hall, writing from Camp Brown, told his wife, We see ladies and little girls in camp every day who come to see the soldiers." Heitsch, also at Union City, described it thus: "We are having a gay time of it here. We are visited every day by the ladies of the neighborhood and also by the ladies of Jackson, Tennessee." U.G. Owens wrote similarly, "Several big dances every night, great excitement all the time, amusement of every kind on earth you could think of. Great many ladies visit us from the country dance, etc." At Camp Truesdale, John Goodner declared, "We have a great many lady visitors here every day from all of the towns around the adjoining counties." The soldiers, itching for a fight, remained mystified why, for months, nothing happened. The bugler of the 154th Tennessee, camped at Randolph, was told to practice the call for general alarm. Through a misunderstanding, he sounded the alarm in camp. Rumors quickly spread that enemy gunboats were approaching. The camp was in a blaze of excitement, and the soldiers panted for the opportunity to display their valor. Writing from Camp Truesdale, Matthew Buchanan candidly remarked, "I wish we had the thing over and had arms and orders to pitch into the Yankees." William H. Russell, a war correspondent for the London Times, viewed some of the fortifications along the Mississippi River during the summer. While some regiments, such as the 154th Tennessee, had uniforms and firm discipline, others were ill-clad and simply lay around camp. The officers, mostly lawyers, merchants, and planters, were entirely ignorant of drill. Russell noticed that the men awkwardly handled their muskets. Indeed, many carried only sticks. When one of the heavy artillery pieces was test-fired, it leaped off the carriage, leaving Russell to believe that it was safer being near the target than on the gun crew. When 800 men lined up for inspection, Pillow offered a brief speech on courage. A staff officer shouted, "Boys, 3 cheers for General Pillow." One wag shouted back, "Who cares for General Pillow?" Discipline continued to be a problem. In Polk's Tennessee battery, a man by the name of Holman kept skipping roll call. The captain warned him several times, but to no avail. When he missed again, Holman was ordered to mark time for an hour. "He seemed surly," Captain Polk told his wife. "I ordered my guard to charge bayonets. One of them hesitated. I sprang up, saber in hand, not drawn, told him that this was no child's play we were engaged in, and ordered him to bring down his gun. He obeyed. I then told Holman to mark time, which he did. The men of Douglas's regiment, 9th Tennessee, collected outside. My sentinels and I saw trouble was brewing. Merely wishing to make an example, I had intended to let the man off as soon as he obeyed, but seeing them and hearing their remarks, I determined he should mark his 60 minutes or die." Polk's officers and men stood by him while he remained seated with pistol concealed, fully intending to shoot the first man who crossed his line. A colonel and several captains came up and dispersed the mob. The men grumbled loudly about the captain, some of them claiming that he treated them like they were Negroes. Cheatham threatened to call out the entire brigade if the 9th continued its rebellion. It did not take long for sickness, mostly measles and diarrhea, to ravage the camps. The lack of preparedness and supplies became apparent. A report in the Tennessee Baptist criticized the makeshift arrangement of a Nashville hospital. The cots were so jammed together that it proved almost impossible to walk between them. The reporter wondered if generals or colonels would be allowed to lie unattended in such filth. One patient noted, "There were several of us together, and all the bunks being occupied, we had to sleep on the floor by the stove. There were 250 men in that room, their bunks all arranged in rows. A chill ran over me at seeing so many pale faces by gaslight." In the early days of its formation, the Army of Tennessee was thus crippled in leadership, preparedness, and discipline. The lack of professional officers and non-commissioned officers resulted in inadequately trained troops, looser organization, and lax administration, all of which resulted in a less pronounced discipline. The Army would eventually emerge from these baked-in flaws, but it would take time. The influence of sectionalism. The Army soon grew beyond the original Tennessee Corps. Richard McMurray recognized that the Army of Tennessee was more Western than the Army of Northern Virginia was Eastern. In late 1862, based on battalions, batteries, and regiments, Robert E. Lee's army contained 61.6% of its men from eastern states, 19.5% from central states, Georgia and Florida, and 17.6% from western states. The lack of an eastern presence, specifically Virginians, robbed the Army of Tennessee of the mythical aura of Virginia and thus affected morale, argued McMurray. When categorizing is done by the actual number of infantry present, however, rather than the number of units, which varied widely, the difference is even more stark. In March 1863, the state-by-state breakdown of the Army of Tennessee's infantry was as follows: Western, 90%, Central, 6%, and Eastern, 4%. A more Western army, though on the surface more homogeneous, did not equate to more harmonious. The Western Theater, that expanse between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, was divided into three major sections: the Upper South, the Lower South, and the Highlands. Precisely why soldiers had trouble identifying with troops from other sections was complicated. According to a Nashville paper, it was partially grounded in the petty bigotry and partisan vindictiveness of politics. Mark Weitz claimed that the South was dominated by localism. Different regions meant different geography and climate, which meant different crops, cotton versus food production, which in turn meant different means of subsistence, which resulted in variant lifestyles and cultures. Sectionalism, especially between the Upper South and Lower South, was grounded in antebellum society and the population distribution of slavery. Lower South states, the so-called Cotton states, had been among the original 7 seceding states, whereas Upper South states had shown a more conservative reluctance toward secession. A perception, untrue to be sure, emerged that Lower Southerners represented the cotton aristocracy, while Upper Southerners were undisciplined, knife-toting backwoodsmen, less loyal to the cause. To be sure, the Upper South was far from a cavalier planter society. Political differences per se in the Army of Tennessee did not revolve around party politics, but rather commitment to secession. Tennessee and Kentucky had supported the moderate Constitutional Union Party in the 1860 election. Lower South troops thus cast a suspicious eye on the latecomers to secession. The question of the commitment of Upper South soldiers came into play at the fall of Fort Donelson in February 1862. Some 10% of the Southern captives, 1,640, took the oath of allegiance shortly after arriving in the North. The overwhelming majority of these came from the Upper South. Indeed, the majority came from 4 regiments: the 18th Tennessee, with 529, the 30th Tennessee, 651, the 51st Tennessee, 138, and the 15th Arkansas, 167. This is compared to 31 who took the oath from 8 different Mississippi and Alabama regiments combined. The Northern Commission concluded, "The prisoners of war from Tennessee appeared to be true and earnest in their desire to become loyal citizens." Surprisingly, the Tennessee prisoners did not originate from the Loyalist Eastern section, but rather from Middle and West Tennessee. The incident raised the question of the commitment of Upper South troops. Indeed, a Baton Rouge paper began to question whether Tennessee was inclined to pull its own weight. The internal tension between the Upper South and the Lower South became evident at Corinth, Mississippi, in the spring of 1862. "I thought my mobile army was a mob, but it is far superior to Polk's and Albert Sidney Johnston's as the one in Pensacola is to ours," Braxton Bragg remarked to his wife. The lack of compatibility extended to the troops. Colonel Andrew Blythe begged to get his Mississippi regiment out of a Tennessee brigade, or this Irish association, as he labeled it. The members of the 11th Louisiana also chafed at being lashed on the tail of a Tennessee rabble, for those with whom we are placed are little better. Such condescending comments might be dismissed as early state pride snobbishness that would soon disappear, but such was not the case. So deep was the sectional divide that negative remarks continued throughout 1863. During the Kentucky campaign, a member of the 7th Mississippi observed that in Tennessee, the people are different. He later added that everyone in Tennessee appeared to be a Union man. In January 1863, J. Morgan Smith of the 32nd Alabama pointedly commented, "I hate the state, Tennessee, the institutions and the people, and really feel as if I am fighting for the Yankee side when I raise my arm in defense of Tennessee soil." He further wrote of alienation between the troops of the Gulf and the border states that may grow into something serious. Kentuckians reciprocated, noting that they were no longer fighting for their state, but rather for a handful of Alabama and Mississippi cotton planters. One contemporary observer noted that the brigades of the Army of Tennessee had been organized by state in order to create a sense of esprit and local pride. Yet the organization had the opposite effect, dividing the army into cliques that produced feelings of bitterness, envy, malice, and hatred. The animosity between the Tennesseans and Mississippians was particularly noticeable, the observer claimed, while a similar feeling existed between the Arkansans and Alabamians. Nurse Kate Cummings noticed, "We have a number of Louisianans in the hospital. Like all from that state, they are very clannish." The problem of the existing sectional divide was exacerbated by President Davis, who devised a policy of dividing territory into departments, each with its own mission and commander. Although department lines changed many times during the war, in the West they initially fell into Department No. 2, Upper South, and Department No. 1, Lower South. After July 1862, Department No. 1 and the Alabama West Florida Department were merged with Department No. 2 to form the huge Western Department. This merger included Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton's Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana. While the departments gave a semblance of structure, they also broadly conformed to the existing sectional and cultural divides of the West. These departmental sectional divides formed the genesis of many of the cliques and factions that developed in the Army of Tennessee. When Braxton Bragg assumed Army command in the summer of 1862, his primary support block came from the Department No. 1 Lower South region. Several of the pro-Bragg generals, Patton Anderson and Jones Withers in the infantry and Joseph Wheeler in the cavalry, began their association with him while serving in the Army of Pensacola. Likewise, the anti-Bragg bloc found its base largely in Department No. 2 Upper South generals, Benjamin Cheatham, John McCown, and Nathan Bedford Forrest of Tennessee, Patrick Claiborne of Arkansas, and John C. Breckinridge and William Preston of Kentucky. There were, of course, nuances and crossovers. Daniel Adams, Randall Gibson, and Leonidas Polk, all Louisianans, fell into the anti-faction. The Highland influence in the Army, though not extensive, proved to be yet another factor in the sectional divide. By January 1864, the Army counted at least a dozen infantry regiments from the Appalachian region, 1 from Alabama, 7 from Tennessee, and 4 from Georgia. These troops had their own unique culture and war aims. McCown, an East Tennessean, once blurted that the Confederacy was nothing more than a damned stinking cotton oligarchy, gotten up for the benefit of Isham G. Harris and Jeff Davis and their damned corrupt cliques. The less than enthusiastic support of the Highlanders revealed that many agreed with that sentiment. Keith S. Hebert's study of Bartow County, Georgia, an upper central county, revealed 3 subregions. Of the 940 men from the county who enlisted in 1861, 89% came from the 2 planter regions. The Appalachian Hill Country portion gave only 15%. Fannin County, an isolated mountain region near the Tennessee border, offered little support for the Confederacy. Hebert concluded that the mountain regions either opposed the Confederacy or were ambivalent. While troops from the upper and lower South had a pique with one another, they united in their disdain of the mountain people. They saw them as dirty, Union-supporting, and unbelievably low-class people, and the women were ugly to boot. As the Army passed through East Tennessee, Alabamian James Searcy noted that the people look fit only for the rocks. The women he denounced as still worse, such people as you would suppose traitors to be made of. A member of the 48th Tennessee, on a foraging expedition in October 1863, expressed dismay at the poverty he witnessed in the East Tennessee mountains. "They are some of the poor."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?